All right, today we're going to dive into what is, honestly, one of the most beautiful stories ever told. It comes to us from the Roman poet Ovid. We're talking about the tale of Baucis and Philemon, and it really gets to the core of something the ancient world took incredibly seriously, this sacred duty of hospitality. So let me ask you something right off the bat. Imagine this. Two strangers knock on your door. It's late, they look exhausted, maybe a little down on their luck. Pretty unremarkable. But what if they were actually gods, in disguise, putting you to the test? For us, that's kind of a fun thought experiment, right? But back then, in the ancient world, this was not just a hypothetical. How you answered that knock at the door could have some serious, divine, and sometimes, devastating consequences. So let's see exactly how this all went down. Okay, so here's the setup. We're in a region called Phrygia, which is in modern-day Turkey, and who decides to take a little stroll on Earth? None other than the king of the gods, Jupiter, and his son Mercury, the messenger. They're disguised as regular mortals, and they've got a mission. They want to see what humanity is really made of, and, maybe just find a decent place to crash for the night. So they start walking. They go from house to house, from these big fancy villas to simple farmhouses, just knocking on door after door after door. And they're keeping a tally. 100 doors, 500 doors. In total, they knocked on 1,000 doors. And you know what happened? Every single time. The door was slammed shut, bolted, locked up tight. Imagine that, 1,000 rejections, one right after the other. It was a pretty terrible look for the people in that region. But the test wasn't over just yet. And then they spot it. Just the smallest, most humble little place you can imagine. A tiny hut made of straw and reeds. And at this door, finally, it opened. This was the home of Baucis and Philemon, this wonderful elderly couple who had spent their whole lives together right there in that little home. The way Ovid writes about them is just perfect. He says they knew they were poor, but they handled it with such grace that it didn't seem like a burden. They were a team, a perfect unit. They didn't have servants, they just had each other. And it was into the simple, beautiful world of theirs that they welcomed these two strangers. Now look, they didn't have much, not at all. But everything they did have, they offered without a second thought. Philemon gets a chair for the guests, and Baucis throws the simple cloth over it. She gets down on her knees and literally breathes life back into the dying embers of the fire. They go out to their little garden to pick some vegetables, and they even take down the one small piece of smoked pork they'd been saving. You can just feel the care in every single thing they do. And here's a detail from Ovid that I just love. As they're setting the table, they realize one of the legs is too short, so the whole thing is wobbly. And it's not like they have a workshop out back to fix it, right? But Baucis is resourceful. She finds a little piece of a broken pot, a potsherd, and she just wedges it right under that short leg until the table is perfectly steady. Ovid's line here is just fantastic. He says, testa parem facest, which means a potsherd made them equal. Isn't that great? It just shows so perfectly that their hospitality had nothing to do with wealth. It was all about paying attention, about caring enough to fix the small things to make their guests feel welcome. So yeah, the food they served was simple, but that wasn't the point. Ovid says the real main course was their goodwill, their kindness. And this wasn't just some poetic idea. The Greek writer Chrysostom said the exact same thing. He noticed that it's often the poorest people who are the most generous, the most ready to share what little they have. And as they're all sitting there eating this humble meal, well, all that simple generosity is about to be rewarded with something completely out of this world. Things are about to get very, very weird and miraculous. So they're pouring wine for their guests, and suddenly Baucis and Philemon notice something impossible. Every time they pour from the wine bowl, it just fills itself back up. The wine just keeps coming. And you can imagine the look on their faces. It's this mix of total awe and, frankly, a little bit of terror. They realize these are not normal guys. So now they're freaking out, right? They think, oh no, our simple little meal isn't good enough for these beings. So they decide to sacrifice the only other living thing they have, their one and only goose, who's also kind of their guard dog. But, well, they're old, and the goose is fast. So what happens? The goose makes a run for it and hides right at the feet of the guests. And the gods just smile and tell them, hey, don't worry about the goose. And that's when they finally come clean. We are gods. Okay, so the gods lead this poor, stunned couple up a nearby mountain. They tell them to look back at their village. And what they see is shocking. The entire town, every single one of those houses with the locked doors is gone, completely swallowed by a swamp. The only thing left standing is their tiny little hut. But then, as they're just staring, the real magic happens. Their little hut begins to transform. The wooden posts stretch up into huge marble columns. The straw roof just bursts into light and becomes pure gold. The dirt floor smooths out into polished marble. In the blink of an eye, their little shack is now a glorious temple. So the gods have done their thing, punished the inhospitable, and now it's time to reward the good. But Jupiter's not done. He has one more gift. He turns to Baucis and Philemon and basically gives them a blank check. He says, ask for whatever you want. Anything. Now just stop and think about that for a second. They could have asked for anything. Money, power, to be young again, you name it. But they talk it over for a moment, and then Philemon speaks for both of them. Their wish is simple. They ask to serve as the priests of this temple for the rest of their lives, and then, because they've had such a wonderful life together, they ask to die at the very same time, so neither one would ever have to bury the other. I mean, come on, that has to be one of the most beautiful, selfless wishes in all of literature, right? And the gods granted their wish. They lived out their days taking care of that temple. And then, one day, they were very, very old, just standing on the steps and telling stories of their life. And they both started to feel something strange. They looked down and saw leaves sprouting from their fingers. They watched as bark started to creep up their bodies. And just before they were completely transformed, they looked at each other one last time and whispered, "Farewell, my love." And they became two trees, an oak and a linden, growing together, side by side forever, from one single trunk. Wow, it's just such a powerful story. And it's so much more than just, hey, be nice to strangers. It really gets at these deep, ancient ideas about how we're all connected, to the gods, to each other, and even to nature. And this whole idea that hospitality is the sacred thing, it's everywhere. You see it in the Book of Kings, with the story of the woman who makes up a simple room for the prophet Elisha. Just a bed, a table, a stool. It's the same spirit. And that final image of good people turning into strong, beautiful trees, that metaphor for a good life pops up in so many different cultures and texts. Ovid really spells out the moral of the story for us at the end. It's all about reciprocity. Basically, what you give, you get. You show care, you get care in return. You show reverence, you are revered. The simple, honest-to-goodness kindness of two people in a tiny hut was noticed, and it was rewarded by the gods in a way that would literally last forever. And that really brings us full circle, doesn't it? Back to that little, wobbly table, fixed with just a broken piece of a pot. It kind of asks us a question, I think. In our world today, which can sometimes feel like it's full of 1,000 bolted doors, what does true hospitality even look like? What's the modern version of finding that potsherd to study the table for someone else?